Hi everyone, it's great to see all these smiling happy faces here, and I was particularly excited to come and see Lucy Saunders present today. I saw her present about 5 years ago in Melbourne and was very inspired by that. So today I'm going to try and be a little bit interactive, and I know we're going to have a panel discussion after this, which is great. So I'm going to ask a question of the whole audience here. Who walked here today, including as part of a public transport journey? Wow, okay, all right. And who rode their bike here today? All right, yes, I took a photo, I put it on Twitter of all these people with all these bikes parked out the front this morning. Today I'm going to be talking about walking and cycling for transport principally, and streetscapes as places for people. And I'm presenting on behalf of both Transport for New South Wales and the Government Architects New South Wales. So, government priorities. In March 2018, there were 3 key documents that were all released at the same time. We had the Future Transport Strategy, which talks about connecting each of our key CBDs within sort of a cycling network within 10 kilometres, and it talked about 5 kilometres around our strategic centres. It also talked about how walking and cycling are key to accessing public transport and that they need to be the most convenient option for short trips. The State Infrastructure Strategy has 3 recommendations directly related to walking and cycling. So it talks about having business cases for investing in protected cycleways, in partnership with local government and integrating with the green grids. That was recommendation 50. It talks about having a 10-year rolling program, prioritising active transport, and it talks about integrating health into land use planning and transport strategies, which is really about what we're talking about here today. And of course, the metropolis of 3 cities has walkable places as one of its headline indicators, and I'll come back to talk about that in more detail in a moment. And again, how walking in particular and cycling support place. Can anyone point out where this photo's taken? Burke Street, yes, and that's a couple of kids riding to Crown Street Public School, and their mum's on a little kick scooter. Jim Betts is the new Secretary for Department of Planning, Infrastructure and Environment, and he made this comment in July this year. 1.7 million people are expected to move into Sydney over the next 20 to 30 years, and there's no way the city will cope unless priority is given to public spaces, active transport and the management of urban parks. And I think that's again at the heart of what we're talking about today, the livability component. So Transport for New South Wales has got I guess everybody here who put up their hand and said, you know, anybody who got here, unless you live next door, you've been a transport customer today. The scale of this is quite large. So our estimations are that there are about 1.1 billion trips a year in New South Wales that are made on foot. So about 500 million of those are made as a walking only trip, and around 600 million are made as part of a public transport journey. Every time you go to catch public transport, it's likely that you've walked to or from that stop or station. These are the 6 customer outcomes for Transport for New South Wales, and walking and cycling support all of those outcomes, but particularly relevant today is around successful places. The livability of our livability, amenity and economic success of communities is enhanced by walking and cycling for transport. We also know that there's strong latent demand for cycling in New South Wales, so about 70% of the New South Wales population have said they would ride a bicycle if there was the right, safe environment for them to do so. And that's one of the things that we're working on. Does anybody know where this is? Has anyone? Hands up if you've been to this spot. Penrith? Yes, yes. The name of, and can anyone name, I guess it's down there, the Yandai Nepean Crossing. I think what's really lovely and poetic about the name is that it's the Darug word for walking in past and present. And I think that's a really lovely way to express our connection to country there. So we do have an annual grants program that is for councils to apply for. Also state government agencies can apply for it. So it's an annual grants program. That portal will be opening soon if you're wanting to apply for that funding. We also have the Cycling Infrastructure Fund, which is funded through Restart New South Wales, and so there's around about $256 million over the next 4 years being spent on direct grants to councils and other agencies, in addition to incorporating active transport into major projects. We've also been working for the last, as I sort of mentioned earlier, the state infrastructure strategy says that we need to be doing a series of business cases for looking at how we can increase our investment or substantiate that. And so we've been working for the last 8 months with councils, all of the councils in Greater Sydney, to try and co-design what's the principal bicycle network. So this is in councils' own gazetted plans, in addition to sort of thinking further about how they're connecting their regional interconnections amongst each other. How we're delivering all of this in partnership with local government. So this is a pretty big piece of work. It's not publicly available at this stage, but we will be looking to make as much of that public as we can as we progress. We also think that once we've also had an independent peer review of that network, and I think it's a very substantial and positive piece of work that we're doing. If we were to complete that whole network, our estimate is that we'll move, just for the journey to work component, from about 0.9% now across the Greater Sydney to about 5%. And obviously that's much higher in some locations. So keep your eye out for that coming out. So coming back to the Greater Sydney Commission's work, as Rod showed earlier in his presentation, and also as Heather pointed out as well, the Greater Sydney Commission's got this sort of 10 indicators or outcomes that they've been working towards delivering. And recently they released the Pulse of Greater Sydney document that actually goes down to 4 key indicators. And I think this is a really important thing to note. One out of those 4 indicators is on walkable places. I think that's a really key moment for New South Wales and for Sydney in particular, that we're recognising, this is the community feedback, recognising that walking is really, really core to our communities. And so I guess the challenge for us as a transport agency and for government as a whole, how do we support the community and how do we support councils to deliver walkable places? And that starts with how we measure that. So we've been looking at two key components, and we'd love to get your feedback around this. 2 key components that we've been considering is it's about walkability, which is a combination of things like mixed land use, density, crossing opportunities, and amenities such as shade, noise, trees, footpath width, those sorts of things. So those things, you know, can we quantify that down to a number that can be reported on? And it'd be great for us to be able to include that in the next iteration of the Pulse of Greater Sydney report. And then we're also looking at pedestrian activity. So how much are people walking within an area? We're still to test this, but our hypothesis is that you may have an area that's got a high level of pedestrian activity, lots of people walking around because they have to, but it may not be necessarily a particularly walkable place. And likewise, you might have quite a walkable place that ticks lots of boxes, but you're not getting a lot of pedestrian activity. And then you might want to dig down into why that is. Is it because there's some big roads that are too hard to cross? Is it because people feel unsafe at night? You know, what are the various factors that link to that? And of course, there's the 30-minute city component as well. Our current measure for that is public transport within 30 minutes to your nearest strategic centre, which includes the walking component of that. So it might be all walking, so it takes you 30 minutes to get to that centre, or it might be that it takes you sort of 5 minutes to walk and 25 minutes on public transport. So that's how that measure is at the moment. So walking, it's just fundamental to our everyday activities. It's how we get around, etc. We are wanting to increase walking as the preferred choice for short trips to key destinations. So that's to our strategic centres, local centres, schools, transport hubs, workplaces. So we're currently and we also want to look at active travel to schools as part of that. So a pretty surprising statistic that we've found is that when you see a car with a passenger in it in the morning peak, 60% of those cars with a passenger is a parent taking a child to school. just to primary school and secondary school. I mean, that's a really alarming statistic, actually. And we all know that plays out on school holidays, which starts on Saturday. You know, a lot of people going, woohoo. But also about 70 to 75% of public school children live within a 20-minute walk of their school. So that really shows there's both an opportunity and a cost to that at the moment. So maybe one way to deal with traffic congestion is that we actually get more kids to be walking and cycling to their local school as a form of investment. So that's one of the things that we're exploring over the next few months. And we'll be looking at that question of walkability and walking mode share. But key to that as well, I think somebody asked the question of sort of reduced mobility access, so for disabled or less abled bodies, as you can see here, and for kids as well, so that we're reaching the broader spectrum of society. It's not just sort of able-bodied, fast-moving walkers, etc. So this part here, has anybody heard of movement in place? Put up your hand if you've heard of movement in place. Okay, wow, that's a pretty big cross-section, which is great. So this is, I guess, the Government Architect New South Wales is working very closely with Transport for New South Wales and other agencies to try and develop this movement in place tool. And I think Lucy Saunders sort of touched on aspects of this in the early work of Transport for London. And it's really trying to say that streets have multiple functions and trying to understand the fact that it's both moving people and goods as well as being places for people and for the community. And that's really at the nub of where we've got quite different approaches. That applies also to councils, it applies to our traffic committees, it applies to our urban design. How do we fundamentally achieve these two sort of quite different perspectives all in the streetscape? So I guess what this diagram is trying to show is that a street has got lots of different components to it, and so this is if we take this to a slightly more complicated diagram, it's probably a little bit unreadable from a distance, so apologies for that. I don't know if I can point to what it's trying to say is that on a typical sort of street intersection, you've got about 35 different organisations or agencies who have some interaction with this streetscape. So that might be Department of Planning, it might be the local authority for approvals, the Chamber of Commerce, the building owner, the landholder. You know, this section here might have local business who are setting up and removing temporary furniture. It might be that they've got sort of fixed and, you might have a designated contractor such as JC&Co who supply advertising and bus stops and so on. You might have Sydney Water, Transgrid, NBN, Traffic Committee, the Road Safety Officer. So you've got all of these various organisations in charge of the street. And I guess that's how do we bring that governance together in a way that's actually functional and delivers on healthy street outcomes. And I think that's really at the core of what I'd like to get out of today. So this document was published by the Government Architect's Office in mid last year. We're also developing the next iteration of that going forward, which I'll show you in a moment. But it's really trying to looking at how we balance those various competing interests of movement in place, and also provide, I guess, a set of principles and practitioners guidance, which takes me to my next point. Here, this is a bit of a complicated slide, but I guess what this is trying to show is that we've got these government policies sitting at the top, in addition to international best practice, which we've heard a little bit about today. We've got a series of guidelines which we want to bring down into a toolkit for practitioners. So over the next sort of few months, we'll be releasing a movement in place practitioners toolkit that'll be available through the Government Architects New South Wales website, and there'll be a fully sort of government endorsed series of hopefully helpful practitioners guides about how do we implement this, what does that mean for your work on a day-to-day basis as a practitioner. And then on the left there, it just talks about the governance of that. So we do have a steering committee that is managing that, and that includes Treasury, Infrastructure New South Wales, Government Architect's Office, Premier and Cabinet and so on, who are all part of steering that. So we are trying to have a whole of government approach to that not thinking only in silos. So I just, what can councils do about this? So is anybody here involved in doing the local strategic planning statements? There's a few of you, yep. So the local strategic planning statements are currently underway. They've been going through both community consultation and feedback. They are kind of, I guess, trying to get from the very high level district plans down to a pre-LEP stage, so that we've got a strategic approach to how we're doing our land use planning and delivering for the community for better outcomes. So some practical things that councils could consider in that, and I think in particular taking into account the Greater Sydney's Commission's feedback about the walkable places, because I think that has come out since some councils have put out their LSPS statements. How is council delivering walkable places, not just as a sentence or a paragraph in the document, but deeply thinking through that? So some of them might be through site links through larger blocks. If you've got a golf course or an industrial site or a larger site that's coming up for redevelopment, you could earmark that to say, when that gets redeveloped, let's create a through site link to create that permeability for people to get from one place to another. It's a really basic move, but that's a practical application of that. Having footpaths and cycleways shaded with substantial tree canopies. That means having enough root ball, that means having enough canopy aside from electrical wires and so on. Thinking about those mid-trip facilities and end-of-trip facilities, so seats, shade, water fountains, toilets got mentioned earlier. Having footpaths that are wide enough for a broad range of the community to use. If you've got a pram and you're passing someone, you've got your toddler with you, etc. How do you have that communal engagement, whether that's on a high street or in a suburban street? And then also how we're thinking about linking between councils. One of the things I've noticed is you might be on particularly on a council boundary between one council and another, often there's a footpath missing. I'm not sure why that's the case, but this is a practical application of what's the experience for our community. And obviously convenient crossing opportunities, that's an ongoing issue around that one. So this is my last slide. How can we take an integrated approach to open space, land use planning, health and active transport, either working as a practitioner, working as a council staff, working at state government? How do we bring all of this together and deliver better outcomes for our communities? Thank you.